We were born over 30 years ago with a mission to digitally transform organizations. 1988 was the year we took off to help our customers and partners discover new worlds. Worlds where organizations are more agile, efficient, and able to change according to market needs. Where management systems become growth drivers instead of barriers. Our formula for success is no secret. Models are the recipe for quickly designing innovative products that are ready to face the future. To fuel this mission, we train new people with modeling knowledge every day. We fight for a new world where knowledge in software development is democratized. We GENIU, or Generative Artificial Intelligence tool, professionals with specialties in the most diverse areas reach extreme levels of productivity, far superior to those who develop solutions coding manually. We have specific solutions for over a dozen industries, but we do not believe in the one-size-fits-all. All our systems are adaptable to different realities. Every customer is unique. We are focused on the quality and safety of everything we developed, as well as social and environmental responsibility. It was this vision that allowed us to grow in Portugal, to be recognized by members of various governments, and to take national technology to foreign markets. First with East Timor, and currently in 20 geographies on all continents. But the long road we've already traveled is just the beginning. We want to continue to innovate to create more value for the members of our ecosystem. We want to make the organization's universe more sustainable and resilient to rapid and expected changes. We count on you. Count on Quidgest.
Okay, welcome today for another Q Talk. Today we're talking about islands and why islands in this space. And with us we have James Ellsmore. He's going to give us a little from Island Innovation. He's going to give us some insights about working with islands. And we're going to have a conversation. Make sure to use the chat to have any questions that we can answer as best as we can. If not, we'll follow up for sure. And then we're going to give you some cases of projects that we've done in islands. So if you want to stay tuned on that or not. So welcome, James.
Thank you for having me.
And James, just to give you a brief background, is the director, CEO, founder. Can we have more names on that? Of Island Innovation. But he also worked in other areas of field with governments, pushing renewable energies. With NOGs in a lot of different countries, Jamaica, Barbados, Maldives. He actually lived also in the Caribbean, United States, Colombia, and now in Lisbon.
Now in
Portugal, Lisbon. So he's going to give us some brief introduction about islands and why islands and why transformation in government in islands. And then we're going to have a small conversation. So join us.
Thanks so much for having me. Can I go into the presentation?
Yeah.
Great. So I'll be talking a little bit today about the idea of remoteness and how the digital revolution in many ways is changing what it means to live in a rural, remote, or island location. So my background, as Hugo mentioned, is renewable energy and the sustainability side. And I'll like to make that link a little bit between the digitization and sustainable development, as I would term it. But firstly, why islands? Why are we talking about islands today? How is this relevant to the work that Quidgest does? Well, as you can see from this map, I love this map, looking at all the islands in the world, and a huge portion of the world's population live on islands. We'll be generalizing a little bit today because, of course, trying to compare islands as diverse as the Azores, Fiji, Jamaica, Greenland, there are many, many differences, but there's also many things that unite them. And islands make a very interesting case study when we look at sustainable development and digitization to see how these processes can be carried out and how changes can be made in maybe a smaller context, but then also moved into larger global contexts. Islands are often known as particularly vulnerable to impacts like climate change, but also economic shocks. many of you will know the risk that many islands face from sea level rise, especially in places like the Maldives and the Pacific, the intensification of hurricanes and cyclones, and the impact that this has, that this climate change has on many island communities, and that many of the populations are concentrated along the coast, and the impact that comes like that with that. And it's interesting to, and we will later on, make this link between all these impacts from climate and environmental change, and why the digitalization is relevant when we talk about resilience for island communities. On the economic side as well, it's important to note 9 of the 10 most tourism-dependent regions in the world are islands. And so when the global pandemic happened, islands in general were some of the most hard-hit places due to this reliance on tourism, in many cases taking up huge chunks of the economy. But why this is relevant is that I think we need to look at islands as lighthouses for innovation and change. Small island communities can also be places where change can happen quickly, and systems that would take years to do in the in a large mainland country can be changed. So I like this idea of a lighthouse for innovation, because you can do things on islands that would not necessarily be possible, at least not as easily, on the mainland areas. And also, islanders themselves are, by definition, innovative, because when you live on an island, you don't have all the same resources that you have in a large city or mainland. So just to mention a bit about island innovation, and then we'll go into a conversation. We are a social enterprise. We're focused on what I call sustainable development, which is really a catch-all term for everything on an island community, not just the environment, but the economic and social aspects. Sustainability is really important to cover all of those. And so again, the economic and governance aspects of digitization, which we'll be talking today, are super important. And because we have this global network, as I mentioned, we see islands facing similar challenges and similar opportunities. And so the idea is, yes, the Azores and Madeira are very different to Fiji and Samoa, but there are certain commonalities that they have of being small locations, having a importance of government services in those places, the dependence on tourism, etc., etc. And so our job is to help facilitate those connections, and to not only connect islands, but also create bridges between the governments, the NGOs, the private sector, and the research universities in all of these islands to further sustainable development. We have a fully remote team spread across the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, working towards this. We're a team of 18 now, mostly working on islands around the world. And we also have a network of nearly 600 island ambassadors who are our boots on the ground, helping spread the message of sustainability and connecting us with those island communities. One case study to mention of how we see digital connections improving island life is our virtual island summit. This year, actually 2023, will be the 5th year we've held the virtual island summit. And this is an online gathering of more than 10,000 people every year, which contributes to sharing information between different islands, and is essentially creating a community united by remoteness, which I think is a really interesting definition to the change of community in the modern setting. And so we gather people to share stories, share information, and to show what they're doing and how that can be replicated in other places. I have a bit of information about some projects that we're working, but I think I'll discuss them when we get into the conversation. So with that, thank you. And we'll, if we have any questions from the audience or from you, we can go into those.
Thank you, James. Well, I have a lot of questions. I mean, I have way too many, but let's try to keep it as concise as possible, and just also give you that, try to get as much as take out of your expertise as we possibly can in this short time. What type of, you've mentioned the projects that you were going to go into them, and as examples of projects as Islands Innovation have been doing with islands. What do you think has been, what type of support that they can get from your company the different islands? Just to give you an overview of types of work that you
So
can do.
our role in these projects, we are not on the ground implementing projects, but we work with the people to help facilitate them implement projects. So for example, a renewable energy farm, we support renewable energy developers and renewable energy companies in the process of implementing those. The way that we work is, again, having this knowledge of navigating this global, very complex group of very diverse places, but being able to navigate them and draw parallels and connections. And then also with our own team, having the communication and strategic expertise of people who live in these communities around the world to be able to further them. One, I think, particularly relevant project we have that we've been working on recently is as a consultant for an Interreg, which is Interregional European Funding project on innovation for island communities, confusingly called Islands of Innovation, supported by us, Island Innovation. But that's been a really interesting project to support because it's been looking at how island governments in the European Union, so regions like the Azores and Madeira, Friesland in the Netherlands, various parts of Greece, can innovate on their policy and how they can be examples for innovative public policy. And so our role with that was also to help draw these parallels between the different islands and bring in experts that have already implemented similar projects on different islands around the world. The next stage of that project will be the implementation of the same project on digitalization, which I can't go into too much now, but essentially how these island communities can digitize their public ecosystems.
And as you mentioned before, there's a whole different level between some very developed islands and islands that are in the process of reshuffling pretty much the public transformation of the governments. What do you see as, because you mentioned some points like, oh, it's easier sometimes on islands to actually go. I wouldn't say that that's not the reality that I experience with the projects that I've done in the Caribbean. But what do you think have been the main challenges that governments do inquire or they face when they try to go into these ideas? Because I mean, and I'm going into this perspective, I was just in Washington for the spring meetings, and World Bank, IMF, IDB, all of them are pouring money into some of these countries as a way of digitalize and to improve some condition. Climate change is the main key, I think, especially World Bank, they're moving into that trajectory of going in. But then there's the reverse side of it, of those loans and that information. I don't want to go into those details, but what do you think? Funding apparently is there, but what's missing is the expertise in some of the areas to go in and say, okay, we need to implement this policy in order to change this. Do you think it's a perspective of having the expertise on some certain areas, or it's more of getting that message through, to people or voting or?
Yeah, I think it's a wide variety of things. It's multiple barriers that need to be looked at to contribute to making this change. So one is funding, and often the funding is available in some format, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's accessible or easily available. One challenge that many islands face is that they don't necessarily fall in the buckets that funding is often available. So to give you examples, many islands in the Caribbean are actually European territories. Aruba, Guadeloupe, the British Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico is a US territory, and that gives them this difficult situation of where they're often not eligible for funding from their central government, but are not also eligible for these World Bank types of funding.
Right.
Even the island countries that are independent and in theory qualify for large funding, Green Climate Fund, World Bank, often there is a big investment needed to actually be able to access the funding. And so having the expertise to even be able to access that can also be a barrier. I know this was a huge problem with the Green Climate Fund when it first came in, that actually the amount of funding that was available was too big for most islands. And so the level of work that was needed to get into there and the availability of that funding was not designed to suit a small island community. I mean, there are many countries in the Caribbean or the Pacific or Indian Ocean that have under 500,000 people, and so that's the size of a city in many developing countries, South America or Africa.
Yeah.
So this scale element is also an important one. And then the last point is also the education, which I think education means of the voters, but also of the decision makers as well. And so often there's just a lack of awareness, and that's where we try to come in, of how that change can be made, because the alternatives are not freely available. So it's really important to give access to case studies of where change has been made in other locations.
How it's possible. Going back on scale, do you see, because I know you have that community of people that live in islands, do you see they operating also as a community in terms of pressing this type of issues to get scale? Because I mean, if you have a lot of different islands with, we're generalizing everyone, so we're not saying that all the needs are equal to all the islands, or even if islands in the same region, they have the same, you know, some have oil, some don't have oil, you know, money issues always that, it's always a common denominator across everything. But do you see them going in together and say, okay, you know, combining, or they're going, you know, each one in their own to try to resolve their own issues and thinking, okay, maybe, you know, my issues are completely different than my neighbors, so I'm not going to even try to bargain as a, because, you know, yesterday was Union Day here in Portugal, well, or worldwide actually, International Workers' Day. And we know that we have more strength when we're together. So do you see them combining and joining?
I think there's always this friction between joining forces versus competing. I mean, a good example of this would be the cruise or the tourism industry, where you have a lot of places competing over markets. And so in theory, a union of islands that are working together to improve their tourism market or to collectively bargain with the cruise industry could be very helpful to be able to raise prices that are needed there to bring money in. However, there's also the competition. And so there are many examples of islands working collectively together on the international arena in climate change. So the Alliance of Small Island States is a group of island nations that works together very effectively at the COPs, the climate conferences that came after the Paris Agreement, to collectively raise the voices and concerns of those nations. And they, although they make up a lot of very small countries, together they're very effectively able to raise the plight of climate change that that many of them are facing and call for action for that. So there are examples there. I think also one of the challenges is coming back to the digitization topic. It would often make sense for islands to work together collectively to be able to buy systems or buy projects, but each in a region like the Caribbean that's very fragmented and almost every island is a separate jurisdiction in a lot of the region, the systems are actually very, very different that are set up in those places. So there are examples, for example, in the Eastern Caribbean of collectively buying medicines and vaccines and things like that, where there are groups. But yeah, it's challenging, I think, to be able to do that. And a lot of entrepreneurs on those islands realize the challenge of building a company when you have a very small market. You need to be able to aggregate multiple economies together to be able to serve those markets.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I'm not sure, I want to go back to one point, but let me just ask you this in the meantime, which is, do you also think that, and we have our own experience in the Caribbean, so we are, you know, biased in that direction, you know, for the projects that we've done in some of the regions in some islands. But do you also see that, because one of the things for us that was important when working with islands was to ensure that there was a transfer of knowledge to the islands. And I'm not sure all the players have that in mind, of making sure that, okay, not only do we leave them with the technology, or in our case, technology or any other process, but they also are capable of maintaining, and it creates also an economy behind it. I mean, I can imagine, you know, if you're, you know, putting solar panels that, you know, someone has to monitor the network, or I have no idea what I'm talking about, because I have no idea in terms of, apart from, installing on my house. But I would imagine that it could also be a trigger to economic. Do you see that when companies operating on islands, or is that a mind shift that it's been happening, or not really?
I think it depends a lot from company to company. I mean, in an ideal world, of course, we would like to see that companies have that in mind, that they're able to have a knowledge transfer. But I think also it's worth remembering that in many island communities, there are many well-qualified experts living there, and they can potentially provide certain elements or work with external companies. I think that often the challenge for island communities has been that due to the small market size, they've had the brain drain as an issue. And this is where the digitization opportunity is interesting, because in the past, many people would complete their university or even complete their high school and then move abroad to pursue opportunities. And that meant that many people who had specific expertise in certain areas were simply not living there. I think the opportunity now with online work opportunities, also being able to work collectively with experts that might not live on their island, but live on another island, that's really changing the dynamic. And that's kind of what I was getting at in the presentation with this idea of redefining remoteness, that you have access to expertise that may not necessarily be based locally, but can still, collectively be used. But also, hopefully, there's a huge economic opportunity now that many people who previously left are returning to work in their home island communities, or at least people who would have left are now seeing that they're able to take those opportunities and stay. It's really going to change the dynamic, I think.
Are you hearing also that the opposite? Because we know that some countries are actually creating visa programs for remote workers to to move to the islands. Do you see that happening as well, or?
It has happened. I mean, there have been various programs to attract so-called digital nomads or remote workers to come to countries. Obviously, in Portugal, it's very well known that those programs have existed. I think that misses the point. I mean, those programs are interesting and do provide, I think during the pandemic, provided a lifeline of bringing in tourists or long-term tourists, let's say, in regions that depended on that and helped at least bring in some revenue. After the pandemic, there was less of an importance for those. And again, I think that there are opportunities for those remote workers, let's say long-term tourists, to come in and contribute. But unfortunately, most of the programs that I've seen have kind of missed the point that I think is more important, which is making more opportunities available for the people living there and upskilling, delivering training for community members to actually access those jobs. I recently met, there was a remote work conference here in Lisbon, and I met someone that was working in Utah in the US, not an island as far as you can get from the ocean, but has a lot of very small rural communities. And they were actually had a specific program run by the state government to train people in rural communities to access jobs out of state and work remotely. And that was really providing this huge influx of income. So I think finding that balance is really important when we look at remote work, and it needs to be managed in terms of the opportunities and challenges that it can bring.
Going back to the transformation and a little bit of digitalization, I know it's not your direct areas of expertise, it's more ours, but what trends are you seeing? What are governments doing in terms of transformation, island governments? We're always talking about islands here. What trends are you seeing happening right now in terms of governments who wants to transform, or initiatives that you think are good? I mean, at least.
Well, there's
always the dark side of things, right?
There's goals versus reality. I think are two separate things. So I can speak more to the buzz and the interest. You can probably speak more to the reality of what has been implemented. But I know there is a huge e-government in general is huge. Estonia is always the example that is used for e-government. I'm sure in Portugal we would love to see some kind of Estonian model implemented when it comes to dealing with government bureaucracy, for example, and a lot of other countries would too. So Estonia has been held up as an example, and I think there aren't as many examples as I would like for citizens citizen interaction with government, let's say, from islands that take access of to a model like Estonian. So that I think has repercussions across the whole economy for independent workers, for business owners, for all individuals. And then healthcare, the e-health element is huge, and in many ways is a parallel to remote work that I already mentioned, and also education. It's increasing opportunities for services that would not have been as easily available before. And so definitely remote education. There's some really interesting, actually my alma mater, the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, is a really good example of providing education in remote areas. It was a relatively new university, less than 20 years old, that opened to serve the northern half of Scotland, which previously had very limited access to higher education. And by having a mixture of smaller hubs spread out over the whole region, and also remote learning, it allowed people to stay and work in their communities while also having access to studying. The University of the West Indies in the Caribbean, the University of the Arctic in Norway, the University of the South Pacific, all to some extent do similar work around this. And I think that's been a real interesting level of access to education. Healthcare, somewhat similar in many respects. Obviously, there is always a need for in-person healthcare, but allowing people to more quickly access healthcare and access specific experts, I think is also one of the big opportunities.
Yeah, we're seeing health is always, I mean, we all passed through this pandemic, so we always have that feeling of health now is important.
Of island communities often provide conditions that would not be feasible on the mainland. So to give you an example of this, the small island states in general pay 3 to 6 times more for their electricity than Europe. So that's a huge difference and impacts your whole economy if you're paying massive amounts for your electricity. What that actually means, though, it's this big disadvantage, but you can turn that into an advantage. Well, you can implement renewable energy projects that would not necessarily be economically viable on a mainland area, but demonstrate, but trial them and push them. And so this is this idea of lighthouses, and there've been some great examples again in the north of Scotland, but also renewable energy projects now happening in the Azores, in 𝗤𝗧𝗹𝗪𝗏, which can really be demonstration projects with wider applicability.
What have been, if you have to go back to the projects that you have done, or the company has done, what would be like the 5 highlights that projects that you thought of, like, okay, this is a lighthouse, like this is one project that should be, even if in different forms, replicated, or at least people should know that it exists. Because I mean, sometimes that's what we've seen also from our experience, that it's was never done. For example, the case of Jamaica that we were discussing offline, that the government tried 3 times before our solution to implement it, and for them, everyone was like, "Oh, here we go again," Here we go again. This is not going to happen, and sometimes there was that loss of faith, and until it got in. But for them was, I think, one of the key issues when making the decision was like, oh, you guys have done this before in different islands before, so there's hope. I mean, someone was able to do it. It's not rocket science, not inventing the wheel. It has been done. It needs adaptation to our reality, to what we need. So what would be your top 5 or 6 projects that you think, or 10? I mean, as long as time as we have.
I mean, it's interesting to ask the question, because often what I get asked is, well, which island has been most successful, or which island has it all, which is the best example. And there's no one island that has solved every problem. There are different places that have really implemented good projects, and even within an island, there may be certain communities or certain areas that have implemented projects. So, for example, one organization that we work with, which I'm a really big fan of, is the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. It's an organization that finances conservation across the whole of the Caribbean, and actually they took this idea of being an umbrella for all of the smaller funds on each of the individual countries and islands, and providing that network support by grouping them together, financing projects, but also providing support for all their members. That's a really interesting example, I think, of working on the regional level. There have been interesting projects. So, for example, in the South Pacific, the islands of Tokelau, which is a New Zealand dependency, they were able to move the whole island to 100% renewable energy,
Wow.
being one of the most remote communities in the world. But they were able to do that very, very early. It might even be as much as 10 years ago now, by using solar battery storage. And although their emissions and carbon emissions are insignificant on a global level, actually it made a lot more sense for them to do that because it was cheaper and safer than importing diesel fuel across the Pacific from New Zealand. There's a few other islands like that have been able to implement different renewables projects in different ways. When it comes to waste management, and this is one that, people like talking about renewables because it's shiny and fun, but waste management is something I think is really exciting. Like, when you're on an island, what do you do with all that
With
trash?
waste, yeah.
Like, how do you even try and get rid of that in a way, especially when you're in a place that often depends on tourism. So you have to be really careful about what happens with your waste because you want to make sure your tourists are coming back.
Yeah. And incineration is not the key.
Incineration is unfortunately one of the main ways it's being done.
To produce energy,
but it's definitely
not the cleanest way to.
Definitely not the cleanest way. There've been attempts to make cleaner versions of incineration and do it in a more contained way, which does have the benefit of producing electricity, but still doesn't really solve the problem. And actually, solving the problem is really firstly reducing. And so Jamaica actually took a lead on this, and was followed by many other islands of simply banning plastic bags.
Plastic bags, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, to being able to implement those kind of changes of just saying, look, we can't rely on these kind of bags. So there's a lot of different places doing different things. Samso in Denmark, Orkney in Scotland are also well known for utilizing renewable energy and being able to be real pioneers on renewable energy. Orkney is very interesting to me. This is off the northeast of Scotland. There's a group of islands, about 20,000 people, and they've been pioneering electric planes for short distance travel between the different islands. Hydrogen ferries and how they can basically green their ferry system, and so these places in very different parts of the world that I think we'll be able to learn a lot from.
Also, I can imagine that community that you hear a lot of different audience from the different islands complain about things. What are the things that they're working right now that they're trying to change? And they're not, making it's not as visible as, because as a mainlander like myself, as you mentioned before, as a mainlander, sometimes even though in Portugal we have Azores, with multiple islands and Madeira, Porto Santo, we normally talk about the islands as separate things, like their own ecosystem, reality. We love them, but sometimes if you don't live in one, it's kind of like you're not in their shoes. You're not feeling in those shoes. You don't have so what are the problems that they're currently trying to resolve that you see most, in generic terms?
Yeah, I think this does differ from region to region a lot. So in the South Pacific, obviously climate change is considered a huge issue. And much of the international funding, much of the projects happening there internationally are focused on climate. And of course, that's a really critical issue for the region, and no one's denying that. But I think what sometimes gets lost is the people living there on some of these very vulnerable islands are thinking about healthcare and their kids' education and what they're going to eat for dinner that day. And so there's an importance to balance these kind of important global issues with people's day-to-day reality.
Right.
I mean, one, like the food security issue is actually huge for most islands. So when, right at the start of the pandemic, there were those few weeks where we were thinking, are global supply chains going to collapse and are they going to survive? And many islands import 90% of their food. And there was this huge fear of what happens if we're not able to import that. So food security is one that is critical because of not only the cost of importing food and the challenges that brings, but also the quality of the imported food, the rates of obesity, of heart disease, high levels of salt, etc. in many islands is particularly bad because so much of the food is imported. So there's a whole range of issues, and I think in the Scottish Islands, for example, housing is becoming one of the core ones. How can people afford to stay in the islands that they grew up in? And that has other implications. How does it impact a culture when the young people who grew up speaking the local language, being part of that local culture, because the Scottish Islands, especially the Western Isles, have a very specific culture, an amazing Gaelic culture. If the people then can't afford to stay there, what happens to them? So of course, the key issues vary a lot, but most of those will apply on some level or another to most islands.
Yeah. And I don't want to infer from your answer, but putting my perspective on it, it also feels like we have the mainlanders kind of like impose a way of, or at least a line of, like you're mentioning global climate change. And it's probably not for those, for some communities, it's not an issue. I mean, it's a food, it's everything. Are they having the voice that it's needed? Meaning, do you think that islands have been having a voice? I know, for example, I mean, in the Caribbean region, for example, Barbados has been, very, vocal. The Prime Minister has been very vocal about a lot of things. Do you think there's still some visibility in terms of islands versus mainlanders?
I think in terms of visibility, that's an interesting question. I think in the climate change conversation, there has been this growing voice because islands have been noted to be vulnerable. And so yes, there is a conversation. I think Barbados is a really interesting example because they're also looking at the global financial system and the challenges which apply to many emerging economies, but to many islands specifically, of how the global financial system works. So issues like several islands graduated, is the term that the institutions use, to no longer be considered developing countries. That changes what funding is available for them. But the challenges that they may have is that one hurricane can wipe out 200% of their economy overnight. And so this kind of fragility is not always taken into account. And one of the big problems is also the cost of money. So local business owners, people wanting to invest in a project, actually the cost of getting a loan or cost of getting insurance is far higher than you might have on mainland areas because of the way that the global institutions are set up and also the issues of scale faced there. So, there's a lot of very complex issues that come together to mean, okay, renewable energy, in theory, everyone should have it. It's cheaper than running on a diesel fuel, but is it possible to get the upfront investment that you need to install solar panels on your roof? Can you get them insured? This is what we had a recent event, I think we discussed the Island Finance Forum to discuss these issues specifically. The financial frameworks on many of the islands are quite different. And then also in the economy more broadly, normally the government takes on a very important role. And so the government, the number of employees in the public sector is, as a percentage, is often very high. So again, that brings in its own specific needs for those communities.
Going back to the digitalization and technology, have you seen, from your experience, I know it's not your areas of expertise, have you seen how technology and digitalization can help some governments? Have you seen some initiatives, or even if not on direct work, that has brought in some changes, mainly, I would imagine, like public sector transformation? Nowadays, no one thinks without doing it with technology, either technology in terms of having the solar panels or having an electronic system for identity management, for example. Do you recall any projects or any things in particular you've seen?
There's definitely the interest there. You'd be probably better placed to point at those specific projects like the Jamaica project that we mentioned. I think you have others that we'll look at the end of the call. In terms of the public sector transformation. Clearly there's a need for it, but I don't, in terms of specific projects off the top of my head, I don't have any.
What do you think their governments are struggling more in terms of, and I would imagine, the less developed ones comparing to the islands that have governments that are, pretty much established, they have, digitalized programs and all that. For the other ones, what do you think has been, is it like a missing, like a roadmap? Is it that a lighthouse that they don't know the projects? If someone from a government is listening to us today that works on an island, what do you tell them, like, in terms of go here, of course, you're in your community, joining a community, you probably have a lot of things to discuss there that, you can learn about other projects. But what do you think what are one or two missing pieces that you see that, governments have been not looking, or, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the roadmaps, they don't have, an idea because they haven't seen it before. What's missing? I
think there's a couple of issues that come up. So one is the timeline of government decision making being relatively short. 4 years sounds like a lot of time, but it's not to try and do a project that's like a whole overhaul of the government, for example. And so often this has been a challenge, is how do you implement something with this 4 years, where the first year is people getting settled. This is in terms of new elections and new governments coming in. That transition often can be a problem because there's a lack of continuity for public sector projects. So I think that's something to worth keeping in mind. Often when there are case studies, they might seem like they're not applicable in the scale. So even the Jamaica case study, Jamaica is a country of nearly 4 million, but a country like Antigua and Barbuda of 70,000 people, is that same system applicable to them? People need to be able to see, and decision makers need to be able to see projects that are on a similar scale that make sense for them. And then, like any other decision maker, the return on investment and what that looks like, how much is it going to cost, and how that can be implemented. But I think the steps of being able to see this, and then also how to bring those players together. So again, one of our roles, and when we look at sustainable development, we always say, okay, for an energy transformation, or I'm sure this applies to public sector transformation, yes, you need the government, but you need the private sector, you need the civil society, the NGOs, and then to some extent, university and research institutions, all to work together. And this applies to all societies, that those four groups often, even if they want the same thing, they don't speak the same language. So how can those four groups work together to implement change? How can they get on the same page, and how can they learn to speak the same language? So we often play that interpretation role effectively. So to say, okay, the universities are saying this, but in government speak that's this, and in private sector that means this. That's one of the big challenges, but again, that's not just limited to islands. The interesting thing about islands is I think it's easier to see who those players are and how they work together in a smaller community. You can map out and identify those players, which again, in theory, should mean that making that change can be done more quickly if you can get those stakeholders aligned.
No, for sure. I mean, that was my experience as well with working, for example, with Jamaican government, is that decisions do take time. As in every government, it's impossible to wake up one day and decide, okay, let's just, redo all the, public finance or HR or shared service. Let's implement, we had on the, and you can check that as well on our website, on YouTube or LinkedIn. We had the head of transformation, shared services for HR for the government of Jamaica, from TUI, which is Transformation Implementation Unit of the government. And it was funny to see that, yes, you cannot, come in one day and say, okay, let's implement shared services across the government. I mean, it's it's impossible, right? You have all these things that you have to, keep in mind that, it's a long plan of, a couple of years. It's not a one-day thing that to implement. But you do see that it's easy to get them on the table, even if, the outcome is not the one that you were hoping for. I remember being in a lot of meetings and saying, oh, let's just change this small article on the legislation and try to, it would simplify everyone's life. And sometimes they went in a different direction, but they were on the table. They were available. They wanted to change. They wanted to improve. They wanted to ensure that they had the best possible outcome from, the investment they were doing. Do you also think that in islands, well, in most cases, we're in the development side of it, I think the budget is not the same as in the mainland. So I would imagine that they have to make, harder choices compared to having an overall budget. Are we still going on elementary things, like you're mentioning food and other areas? Are we still in that level, or do you see more often that, okay, yes, we need to have those addressed and we're always going generic, but yes, we have those fundamental things that we have to ensure, health, education, so forth. But do you see themselves also leaving some budget for other things, for, more advanced forward projects that's probably, would not give them the election right away, but, it actually gives a sustainable, long-lasting project. And I remember this, one of the times I was doing this project for the government of Jamaica, the government changed colors. Okay. So the opposition went into power, and we went, okay, this is gonna go down the road, and the project's never gonna, it's not gonna see the light of day again, all of that. And I remember going in with the meeting with the ministries, and they were saying, no, we're full on board on this. It makes total sense. I mean, and in that regards, there was that investment. So do you see that they are looking into those other investments that are more like long-term for their economy?
No, absolutely. There's definitely is a willingness to invest in long-term projects like the ones you're talking about. Again, I think it's where does the financing come from for those projects? And if, obviously for government projects, it's a bit different, but if, for example, your cost of your annual interest on a loan is 3 times higher than it is in Europe, that obviously makes you less willing to make a long-term investment. And even for forms of government-backed loans, that still can be challenging, the conditions of those, because for example, for the private sector, if for an international company wanting to make a loan for a project, do you go to a small country of 100,000 people, or do you go to Brazil or Nigeria, to be able to do projects on a huge scale? Your costs to make a loan and to look at local projects are more challenging. So that's where in independent countries, often World Bank funding or other international finance institutions is critical. A lot of those long-term projects will only happen if there is this international funding element. It could also be EU, UK, US aid can also be important as well. That also helps to provide some continuity sometimes. Has a lot of its own drawbacks as well, but it does have an important role. Within Europe, a lot of that funding comes from EU central funding. The long-term projects in Azores, but also the Greek islands, previously in the Scottish Islands, was coming from central EU funding, was critical for this long-term investment thinking. So I think what's often interesting is that islands, from whether it's their national or federal central government, are often able to leverage much more funding per head for projects than would be eligible for a similar sized mainland community. And that is something that almost comes with the iconic island status. So central governments will often like to look at this lighthouse project, put millions of funding in a project for a few thousand people that would never happen in a small town of that similar size. So island communities, in some cases, and more so in developed countries where there is a mainland to the islands that's part of the same country have been able to leverage that quite effectively to gain public funding.
We're getting into the last 5 minutes.
Okay.
So, well, actually 3 minutes. But one of the things that I wanted to ask is if there was 1 or 2 or 3 takeouts, and I'm putting you on a spot, that you would like people to know about how it is to work with islands or to operate with islands, what would that be?
I think acknowledging local expertise and local knowledge is critical. I'm not an islander. We're building a platform that puts a spotlight on those individuals, and we're very conscious of that for our work. So acknowledging the local expertise is critical. Knowing that things work differently for the better and for the worst. There's a lot of positives that come from that. There can also be more challenges that comes from the more personal element that you get when it comes to a smaller community, that people are going to be related or know each other or went to high school, and that's just a fact that you have to acknowledge. But again, that can be a pro or a con when it comes to carrying out work and getting things done. And thirdly, I mean, this idea of sustainable development, which is the term that we always use at Island Innovation, that needs to encompass, yes, the future of the environment and climate and all those things, but you cannot look at a community and look at the environment without considering the people that live there and their social well-being and their economic well-being. And that, for me, when it comes to anything around sustainability, incorporating those 3 pillars is critical for it to be a success, because people will not care about their natural environment if their basic needs are not met. And so those 3 need to balance out.
Thank you, James. Before we close off, also you can know more about the Islands Innovation on their website, and also about the community. If you're listening from an island, make sure to go in and subscribe and join that community and learn about those lighthouses. You can also subscribe to Quidgest as well. And right now we're just going to be passing a small video of some of the projects, cases of transformation, digitalization in governments, especially in islands, in Cape Verde, in Azores, in Jamaica, in East Timor, some of those cases that we've done. So those could be lighthouses also for digital transformation if you are unsure if it's possible or not to better manage your public debt, for example, or your HR. Check those cases as well. Thank you, everyone, and see you in the next Quidtalk. So we're going to just check on some success stories in islands, and we've done a couple of projects in some islands, and we're just going to give you some examples of some projects. I'm not going to go over too many examples, but just give you an overview of some of success stories that we had in islands. So probably the most recent one is in the Ministry of Finance of Cape Verde. It's a public debt management system. So the public debt management system is an essential function of any state. As you know, public debt across the countries has been an issue, and particularly in islands as well, due to some, the financial needs of the governments, the possibility of costs of the public debt. So what was this project about? So the challenge of this project was the implementation of an ambitious process of economics and reforms to the institutions to make sure that the public administration was modernized and competitive. This also, the solution was trying to discontinue a previous solution of debt recording and management. So the solution implemented by Quidgest, which is the PDMS, so Public Debt Management System, it was specifically designed to respond to this operational and strategic debt management needs. So the mission of the PDMS is to support the process and the regular cycle of strategic planning and operational management of the public debt at different levels of intervention. It has a lot of reporting functionalities, both from operational point of view and strategic point of view, but also the communication and support to decision making in terms of public debt. As we can see results, there's this, a significant positive result in terms of the economy of using the public debt to manage better the debt of Cape Verde, ensuring also that it was able to provide more management information at different levels of intervention. Also, there's the reporting capability that I was just mentioning allowed to make decision-making support, and also improve and try to reduce those borrowing costs, as well as increasing the transparency of the government and accountability, which is crucial when you're managing countries' debt, to ensure there's greater trust and confidence in external stakeholders, such as international investors and financial institutions. So this is one example of something that could be expanded to other islands that have the same issue with public management. Now I'm actually going to showcase 3 different examples of people or human capital solutions. The first one is, which was our first in this area internationally, which was with the government of Timor-Leste to manage all public servants workers. So the government decided that this is a UNDP funded project that was needed to ensure that we had to have a record of all public employees digitalized. So this is the kickoff for the particular project. So the solution actually manages all public servants or all public employees of the government of Timor-Leste. So the challenge was they had 12,000 civil servants, 4-time short-term workers, public employees, contract workers, and they were managing in Access, in Excel, in very low level of information and unreliable data, sometimes stored in a single computer for that ministry, for example. So the solution was having an integrated HR solution that managed the personal information of the public employees for all the public sector, so including ministries, departments, employees, contracted or employees both. So the various bodies had online access to the system, one single truth, one single database, one single information regarding all the public sector. Of course, this implementation across 40 entities, 34,000 users managing through the system. Also ensuring that the implementation of the human resource management solution was, delocalized, managed across the different regions and areas that has access to the system, and to ensure that there was an integrated perspective and strategic information of the civil service. Now going into the government of Azores, which is a similar project in terms of that it's also a human capital management system that it's spread across the different islands in the government of Azores. The system replaced over 150 different IT applications that were spread across the different systems with different licensings, with different requirements of hardware, with different application developments, and also allow them to have a shared service centralized environments. So the challenge was, given the geographical distance between the different islands, the repeating processes in each organization for all public employees, automating process, ensuring there is a centralized information and reality across the government, also ensuring that the information was available at any given point in time in every island, to increase productivity and keep going. So the solution was this integrated human resources solution with a more comprehensive comparing to the project that I was just referring to in the government of East Timor, because here we're talking about the full scope of the HR system, human capital management system, with training, with time and attendance, with not only the records, but also the payroll as well. So, it managed more than 18,000 employees across the different regions, agents, so with one single truth, one single database system. So the government identified a lot of different, of course, results like centralizing the information, implementation of shared services, centralized payroll processing. They estimate saving more than 1 million euros in expenses with computer software licenses and so on. Reduce the time lag of the process of the information by 30 days, automatic and permanent data of the system, the possibility of interoperability with other systems, using REST or APIs or web services, reducing procedures and eliminating some procedures that were duplicated across the different ministries or agencies, better budgeting, information, and so on. And this is going to be available also after the end. And one of the last cases is the government of Jamaica, which is another level of the continuation of this type of projects that we've did in Azores. In this case, the government of Jamaica has attempted in the last 3 decades of having this public sector modernized and having this solution implemented in terms of HR. The creation of the Transformation Implementation Unit was established to ensure that a lot of public sector transformation initiatives across the government of Jamaica. And one of them is this HR shared services solution, also in 𝗲𝗲𝗃𝗲, which is the HR solution. So the challenge was that it had over 120,000 employees. I mean, we just went from 20,000 now to 120,000 employees, 6 times more, over 200 ministries, departments, agents, public bodies. And in some of the cases, the system was largely manual. It didn't have much, benefits. It had a wide variety of solutions and systems implemented, most of payroll or just payroll in HR. And it led to poor decision making, bad reviews of the HR. So the government implemented, starting in 2017, the solution, which is 𝗲𝗲𝗃𝗲 by Quidgest, and to enable this delivery of HR in a technology way, but also HR shared service later on. So 𝗲𝗲𝗃𝗲 is a bespoke system that offers different levels of access based on the job function. The system was phased out throughout. It's a web application, so any ministry of the 200s have access to the system and can go in and manage their own data if the services are not provided by shared services. If you're interested in the shared services, that actually we talk about shared services with the responsible for this project of HR shared services. You can check that on our YouTube channel as well. In terms of results, of course, being this a full tailored system, it increased the strategic and efficiency in the HR management system and administration, enabling shared services, greater access to the information through standardized processes, policies, and practices, also with a self-service component, passing to managers and employees access to their own data, analytics to ensure a based evidence approach to the system. For example, they just redone their salary scales, for example, and that was possible also, not only, of course, government legislation, but because they had access to all the information in a centralized system, they can run analytics on top of it. It's more cost efficient. It's one licensing for the whole government. And also it's a secure and disaster recovery plan, ensure that, if storms and earthquakes and all the things that are typical from the Caribbean islands happen, there is a secure platform for disaster recovery in case this happens. So this was just a brief example of 4 or 5 cases that we've had on islands. And if you want to know more, just get in contact with us, or the other, you use the email international@quiggest.com or pass by our website at quiggest.com.